If you're like me, you need to have direction before you learn anything. In this video, I introduce you to Flex, Grid, and Media queries, and I provide coding examples of all three so that you can get the direction you deserve. If you like content like this, be sure to like and subscribe as I take you through my journey to become a successful web developer. Hey guys, Josh with ABG Tutorials, and CSS can feel insanely overwhelming when you're just starting to get into it. I personally feel like a lot better than I used to, but it's overwhelming. There's animations, there's transitions, there's all the properties, there's all of the customization that you can do, and it really does feel overwhelming. So the purpose of this video isn't necessarily to teach you these things, although you will learn quite a bit about all three here. It's to just give you that direction that you need as you continue your learning in CSS, because you're going to have to narrow your focus, and I'm going to narrow my focus in the future, and stay tuned for more videos. But before I could do that, I really had to make sense of a couple things. And Flexbox, Grid, and Media queries, honestly, like a month ago, were very, very, very overwhelming to me. I didn't even know where to start. Hopefully, this helps you. So the idea here behind a Flexbox, a Grid, and a Media query is essentially to make your websites look exactly the way you want them, to an extent, but provide flexibility for all of the responsive designs, because in today's day and age, there are all types of screen sizes, there are all types of mobile devices, and we want our web pages to look good on all of the devices. So these three work together and sometimes solo to provide exactly what you need to do. Flexbox is a little bit more simple and a little bit more limited. So it's best designed for 1D designs. Even though you can do a two-dimensional design with it, it's very limited on the control. That isn't a bad thing, because what it does do is it naturally will flex to the screen or to the viewing port that you're on, which is a good thing. So by default, you can throw something in a Flexbox and it's going to kind of make a decision for you. If that decision was up to you to make, it would be very overwhelming to sometimes decide how you want things to shrink and collapse and stuff like that. With Grid, you can get much more specific and control all types of fancy and complicated layouts where you need to keep structure. Media queries are basically like conditional statements in a programming language. So if you've learned a little bit about conditional statements, if something is true, then we want a certain action to happen. With a media query, you can do that for mobile devices. When the viewing port goes to a certain size, we can change the way that our content displays. All three of these put together gives you total customization of your content on all types of devices. So to make sense of the Flex and a media query, we're going to look at a navigation bar. Now, I'm not going to recreate the wheel here. There are a lot of people who have great content on creating navigation bars. I went through 2 or 3 videos. I started to see patterns and stuff like that. I will do my best to find the videos that I actually went through and link them in my description so that you can use them. But I'm not going to walk you through that. Other people do it and they do it great. Remember, the purpose of my channel is to become a web developer, not to become a master of CSS, not to become a master on YouTube. It's to become a web developer, okay? So I'm just going to show you some applications here. So I've got this navigation bar, and when I change it, like it naturally is, the things flex around and they space out kind of nice. And then this happens. When I get to a certain size, this happens. So this is an example of where a media query would come in, because as the screen size gets smaller, we want our display to change. Because if I were to include all of these links on the top on my mobile device, it's just not going to work. So they kind of use a burger button that isn't visible, but then it is visible. So that's a media query. Now, before I show you my CSS, I want to actually go over a couple things here in my code. The first is I've got this tag called nav. And in my CSS, you're going to see this nav tag gets changed to a display flex. Let's go up. So my nav is display flex. So we can change properties. I'm not going into that. I'll probably make a future video really focusing on flex, grid, and media queries even further. This is intro. So you can customize how things space around when this happens, when things kind of flex, so that it looks the way you want it to. Okay? What I wanted to go over, though, is that this navigation bar that has a display of flex is called a parent. And it's called a parent because there are tags within it. So these would be children. That's something I needed to learn. This div class logo is one child. This list, which I'm using for my links, is another child. And then I've got my burger class, which is another child. Okay? Now when I go at a large screen, I don't see this burger. And the reason for that is because, let me find it, I've changed the display to none. So if I change this, or maybe let's just delete this. We'll cut it so I can paste it back in. And if I come back here and I refresh, look, my burger shows back up. So I'm the one deciding I don't want it there by putting that in there. Because I only want that to appear on a smaller screen size, which is what a media query is for. So here I've got a media query where I'm saying the max width is going to be 768 pixels. From my understanding, that just seems to be the number that a lot of people use for smaller screens because most mobiles are always within that range. And again, I don't want to get into too many details here, but I want to show you what's happening. Within this massive media query, I am now changing my burger to display, to block. So that's why right here, right at this moment, it reappears because it's within my media query. So it's a conditional statement in programming languages. If this happens, then I want my burger to appear. The other thing that's happening here, my links are disappearing. And what's happening is they're not really disappearing. They're just being shifted over to the right by 100%, which would cause horizontal scrolling. But you can see there's no bar at the bottom that wants me to scroll. The reason for that is because I've got this overflow X to be hidden. If I turn this off, all of a sudden everything would shift to the right, but it would want me to scroll to the right. So you can start to kind of see how you can customize things. Yes, it's still flexing, but then there's this point where I want my burger button to appear, I want to shift everything over, and I don't want it to actually scroll. So that's kind of how a media query works. So if I were to change this to like 0%, this transform, and refresh, look what happens. My buttons appear. So the idea here on a more advanced level is that you want this to pop out only when it's clicked. So you could use some JavaScript in there. And you could add animations and stuff like that. those are things I'm going to learn. This was a really useful activity for me, just playing around with properties, playing around with how things shrink around, the idea of children in a Flexbox, and then how a media query can be used to kind of change the content on my page based on a mobile device. So here's a perfect example of a grid layout. Yes, I'm a Blackhawks fan, so I figured I'd add some images and some content just so that I could play around with grid and learn how it works just at the very intro level and how I can apply media queries to my content as well. So in this situation, when I scroll, my content's always staying in 3 nice columns. And it's just kind of shifting around into the 3 nice columns. Now, when I get to a certain point, it switches. And this makes perfect sense, right? If you're on a mobile device, we no longer want 3 columns. It's going to get too narrow. And I want to switch to something like this, to just 1 column. Now, the big difference here between grid and Flexbox is that grid is structured based on the actual parent and not the children. So in the Flex example, I showed you the parent and children based on my nav tag. And as I add a child to that nav tag, the content will naturally change. It'll naturally flex. That isn't what we always want. I might want a structured layout where when I add a child, it doesn't change everything. It just fits within what I've told it. And so that was what I needed to hear. That's what I needed to learn. Okay, it makes sense. Structured layouts, I can customize my parent and all of the children will fit within that, whether it's an image or actual writing. And with Flex, as I added a child, everything kind of changes, okay? So now I'm just going to show you a little bit of this code. I'll move that off to the side and show you a few things here. One thing that I learned was that this number sign, when you're defining CSS, is used if you want to define just an ID. So let's scroll down to my actual HTML. And so see I have an ID page container. I could use a class called page container, and then I would be using up here a period instead of a number sign. So that's pretty good to know. You can control all of the tags with CSS. You can control just a class with CSS, or you can control just the specific ID so that you can add layers to your CSS as you get more advanced. I'm not going to get into all of these little properties and stuff like that. I just want to show you a couple of the basics here. So what you're going to notice here is that you can create this grid template columns, and you can define it or to repeat or not. But if I were to change this to 2 and then save, that would just change my content to 2 columns. Now the FR basically is just going to equally balance my layout. So I'm going to come over here, and I haven't refreshed this page yet. So here were 3 columns. All I did was changed this to a 2, and when I refresh, it changes to 2 columns. So you can kind of start to see, well, I don't want it to look like that, or you can remove some of the children. I just added a bunch of content. Obviously, eventually you can figure out a way to get the image to size and stuff like that. But if we just want 2 columns, it's going to just go 2 columns. And then in comes my media query. So I'm going to switch it back to 3 just because I like the way that 3 looked. Come back here, bring this back up. We will refresh it, and you can see it's doing exactly what we want it to. Back to 3 columns. Here comes the media query. Here's the same max width, 768 pixels. So you can play around with that. You can change that. I know there are other more modern ways to write CSS as well. But I didn't even know what a media query was, a month ago. So in this case, when the max width, 768, I'm going to put my columns to 1. And so that's why it's changing from 3 to 1. It's a conditional statement. That's what's causing this. Switch from 3 to 1. 3 to 1 column. Okay? Now, if I were to change this to flex, the entire thing to flex, I just want to show you what happens and why it's kind of scary if you want structured layouts. So I'm going to refresh. Look what just happened. And do you remember why? Because Flexbox is going to change as you add children. And I have a whole bunch of children in here. And so it's just kind of like this is my media query. My media query is not looking how I want it to because it's set to display flex, where it just naturally makes a judgment call based on the children within it, which is good for simple layouts. But if I want this like 3-column layout to turn into something that's a little bit nicer, I don't really want that. And I know there are always ways to make flex work in more of a grid layout, and there are ways to make grid work more in a flex layout. But I also believe that we don't need to get overly complicated here, since there are so many different devices, so many different screen sizes. We can spend hours trying to make a perfect layout on one computer, and if you go over to your friend's house and load up your web page, it doesn't quite look the same way. So this is just something that I learned, and it gave me lots of direction for not just Flexbox, but grid, and the idea behind media queries, which kind of excited me for the future of learning more CSS. Okay? Now, the one thing I'm going to end on here is just to show you why this last image is so large. It's because I did not put it within this div, the parent of ID content. I have children, this paragraph, this paragraph, this paragraph, and 3 images are all children. So if I were to change that to flex, it would just naturally try and make it work. But because it's grid, and again, my ID is content, so you can see up here, we're using the number sign content. That's not a class. It's just that ID. But at the very bottom, I've got, outside of the parent, 1 extra image. So that's why this image is just hanging out there. I wanted to play around and learn how this kind of works. And I was surprised how by playing around with just a couple basic properties, I was able to get a very responsive design. But what it took was an understanding of Flexbox, an understanding of grid, and an understanding of media queries. That's it for this video, you guys. I hope it made your life easier, because I know by going through the process myself, it really made my life easier, and I am excited to learn a lot more about Flexbox and grid and media queries and animations and transitions and stuff like that. If you like this stuff, guys, be sure to like and follow. As usual, always be grinding.